Today we're going to be looking at domain and range. So let's talk about two definitions. The domain of a relation is all possible x values. And the range of a relation are all the possible y values. So let's look at a set of points. We need to find the domain. The domain here are all the x values. So our domain, we're going to take all of our x's. So that, remember, we goes x comma y. So it's the very first point of each, the very first value of each point. So we have 1, 4, -5, -3, and -8. And this is a list of values, so we're just going to do little squiggly brackets around them. You can make messy 3s to show it. The range are all of our y values. Oops. So, again, remember we have x comma y. So it's the second value. So we have a 2, a -3, a -1, a 1, and a 0. So let's list that out. 2, -3, -1, 1, and 0. And we put the squiggly brackets around the list of numbers. Now, let's do the next one. The domain are going to be all of your x values. So let's start. We have 4, we have -2. We have -2 again. We do not list any repeated numbers. So then we have -5, and lastly 1, and our squiggly brackets around it. Range are our y values. So we have -4, 1, 6, 6, but we don't repeat it. So we just let it be, and then -1 and squiggly brackets. We can also find the domain and range when we have a graph of points. So to find the domain, we list the values of each x. To find the range, we list the values of each y. So, our domain. Let's start from left to right. So, if we're starting from left to right, let's look at the x value of the very first point we get to. That x value is -3. So, we're going to list -3. So, the next point we come to is right here, and that x value is -2. Then, as we go across, we have 2 points on the same x value of 1. So we just list 1 once. And then we have an x value of 4. Put squiggly brackets around it. And then for the range, we're going to go from the bottom to the top. So start at the bottom and go all the way to the top. Now we're going to look at the y values. So this point here's y value is -4. Now if we go up, we have this point, its y value is -2. We go up, this point's y value is 0. Next point, its y value is 3. And our last point's y value is 5 in squiggly brackets. So to identify the domain, a way to think about when it's on a graph is what is the smallest x value. Once you have that value, you're going to determine what is the largest x value. And this is when it's on a graph as lines. If there's an arrow, then the line goes on and on and on, and we call that infinity. So to write the domain, we use inequalities. So inequalities we're going to be using look like this. This is less than. We're going to be using the less than or equal to when we're dealing with numbers. We're going to use the less than when we're dealing with infinity. Okay? So we write the domain using inequalities since the possible x values are between the endpoints. So the smallest value and the largest value. So let's just start with domain. The domain, we're going to start the smallest x value. So we're going from left to right. So the smallest x value is going to be the furthest point that it's off to the left over here. So that's going to be right here. And that x value is -3. So we're going to say x is going to go between two values. -3, so we're going to put the first one on the left. And then we're going to go all the way to the right. The furthest over is 3. And we're dealing with numbers, so we're going to put the line underneath our inequality. So x is in between -3 and 3. Now let's talk about identifying the range. We want to think about what is the smallest y value, and then what is the largest y value. Same thing that we're doing for domain, but now we're dealing with the y value. If there's an arrow, the line goes to infinity. We write the range as an inequality since the possible y values are between the endpoints. So we're going to do the range the same exact way. Smallest. So we're going to start at the bottom. The smallest is right here. And that's at 4. So we're going to do the same setup. Y and then our inequalities. They are always going to have the opened arrow to the right. And if you think of this as an arrow, it's pointing to the left. So it's always going to be this setup. And we said it was -4. How high up does our graph go? Goes right here at 3. So all of our y values are in between -4 and 3. And since we're dealing with numbers, we're going to make this an equal to. And this will make a little more sense once we get into inequalities. But just remember, we put the line underneath if we're putting a number. We're putting an infinity symbol, which, remember, infinity looks like a sideways 8. We're not going to have that line underneath our inequality. Let's look at the next graph. Domain. Domain, we're starting at the smallest x value. So we're going to go from left to right. So domain goes from left to right. So furthest over our graph goes is right here, and that is at 0. So let's start off with our outline. X and our two inequalities on the same opposite side of each other. We're starting at 0. If we start at a number, we put the line underneath. X is going towards, let's see, how far over do we go? Well, we go over to arrows. And our arrows mean infinity, so we're just going to put infinity symbol and no line underneath. Now the range. The range, how far down to how far up? Smallest value is at an arrow, and that means infinity. So let's put our y and our inequalities. We have infinity, but it's at the bottom, so that's a negative infinity. And how high up we go is another infinity, which is a positive infinity. So our y values are in between negative infinity and infinity. So that is today's lesson on domain and range. Please reach out if you have any questions.